Okay, so the red round button has showed up, so we start recording. Welcome everyone to this month's SICS seminar series session, and today we have our very own Krystal presenting, sharing her research with us. But before we start, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Anita Dewi, one of the lecturers in Information Studies at the School of Information and Communication Studies. And I'm just going to be guiding you through the next hour or so. I would like to admit someone who is entering the meeting. But I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging the country. So we would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Kundangara, and Biripai peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt campuses are located, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present. And today we're going to hear from Krystal about her research on, or entitled, Factors Affecting the Teacher Librarian's Influence on Reading Cultures. I'm not going to read the abstract because we have attached it to the calendar invite. For those of you who don't know Krystal, though, which I doubt, Krystal is a lecturer in the School of Information and Communication Studies, and she's part of the TL, or Teacher Librarianship team, and a specialist in school libraries and reading for pleasure. Experience-wise, you can ask Krystal is heaps. And she has completed 2 master education degrees. How about that? MED. One on in teacher librarianship, of course, and the other in educational research. And she is currently completing her PhD. And the research interests would be reading identity, reading cultures, and teacher librarians as influencer. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Krystal. I think we did try you sharing the screen as well, so it should work. Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you, Anita. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am sharing with you a presentation that I've done at a couple of different conferences now. It has evolved every time that I do it. So this is the work that I've been doing on my PhD. So I'm happy to share it with you today. I too would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of all the various different lands on which we come together from today. For me, that's the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I also want to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripai peoples of Australia, who are those traditional custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located. And whenever I do presentations as a CSU staff member, I always share our Wiradjuri phrase of Yinyamara Wanangana, which is the aim for us all to learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in a land worth living in. And I love that phrase and I share it at every conference because I think it so embodies not just what the university is about, but also what teacher librarians about and school libraries and libraries in general. So they always get warm and fuzzies when I share that phrase. So I just wanted to highlight that today as well. So my plan for today is I will do a quick methodology reminder, but then I want to go into the preliminary findings that I have, as well as some of the observations, as I'm calling them at the moment, which I have been sharing with the teacher librarian and school library community as things that they can take away as practical applications of my research at this point. They're still very preliminary, but they certainly have been great conversation starters between me and the school library practitioners. So very quickly, the methodology that I'm using is a mixed method approach, but it's definitely more focused on the qualitative side of things, that being the interviews that I have been conducting. The research questions that I have been answering, the major one is, what factors affect the teacher librarian's influence on reading cultures in schools? With the sub-questions of, how does a student's reading identity shape that influence? How do staff and students perceive and experience the culture in their school? Reading culture specifically, and then what are the underlying structures and systems in the school that are evident that either help or hinder the teacher librarian's influence. And that last one in particular has been really eye-opening for the teacher librarians that I've been sharing my results with. So that's been really exciting for me. In terms of the data that I have collected so far, I was able to do surveys at 3 different schools. I had 100 students participate in the survey across the 3 different schools. I'm really grateful that it's 100 because that makes my statistical analysis super easy because it's, the percentage is the number. It's great. It's so good for me. And then I've had 12 staff across the 3 different schools contribute as well. From those surveys, my primary reason for using those was to identify reading identities of the students using a particular approach to the survey that I used. It's called the Adolescent Motivation to Read profile, and it measures a student's self-confidence in reading and the value that they place on reading. And so I used that process to split them up into reading identities, and then that's how I selected students for follow-up interviews. So I ended up doing interviews with 15 students across the 3 different schools. I spoke to 10 teaching staff. They identified whether they were interested in doing a follow-up interview after doing the survey with, so that was really simple in terms of selecting those staff. And then I got to talk to the 3 principals, which was fascinating. And of course, I talked to the 3 different teacher librarians, and I got a chance to chat with a library technician who is a qualified librarian but employed as a library technician. And yes, they did their degree with us at CSU, which is super exciting. So in terms of the split, this is roughly what, not roughly, but this is what I had. So, you can see that I had more year 9s than year 7s, which I thought was really interesting. The ABC represents the school A, school B, school C. So school A, I must admit, is teeny tiny in terms of population size compared to the other 2 schools. So when I will work out the percentages, these are numbers at the moment, but when I work out the percentage of the students who participated in the survey versus the school population in those year levels, my gut feeling is that the ratio or the representation is actually going to be bigger in that school A, just because the school has less than 300 students, and the other 2 have close to 1,000. So I'm really interested in that. From those, this is the spread of the interviewees that I spoke to in terms of students. So I got to speak to more year 9 students than I was expecting, which is really great because from my research, the literature, from my background as a teacher librarian myself, year 9 students are tricky when it comes to reading. That's where they really have solidified their identity as a reader. And so I was so glad to be able to speak to more year 9s because they are the ones that I really wanted to go, what's happened? How did what interventions happened, or why do you love reading, or why don't you love reading? So it was really great. So preliminary findings. These are just some of the things that have come out in my initial analysis. So as I said in the beginning, talking about my methodology, I did divide students up into reading identities. So I have 4 reading identities that I have based off the literature. And having now done some more data analysis, I am realizing that there are different levels within the different reading identities, but I'll get to that in a minute. But for the purpose of identifying students and then interviewing them, I had the 4. So we have reluctant readers, and those are the ones that just say, I'm not a reader. We have struggling readers, and they're the ones that struggle with reading. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to read, and that is what differentiates them from a reluctant reader versus a struggling reader. Struggling readers are still on that cusp of, I don't find reading easy, or I have difficulties doing reading, but I still want to, or I still think it's a valuable use of my time, which is where that adolescent motivation to read profile is really great because it does measure, it captures that self-concept and the value. So struggling readers have a lower self-concept, but they often have a higher value score, which is different to the reluctant readers who can sometimes have a slightly higher self-concept, but a really low value. So that's been really interesting. I also then have proficient readers. Proficient readers are probably the most common, particularly in just high schools in general, and even adults, they are the readers who can read. They read quite well, but they choose not to. They choose to do other things with their time. And they are probably, in my opinion, the identity that is at most risk because proficient readers can fly under the radar. You just, they're doing well academically. They are, um, everything's fine, everything's lovely. But because they don't practice that skill or they don't continue to read, they are at risk at slipping. But we often just, overlook them because we think they're doing okay. And then you have your avid readers who are the ones that are just super into reading. They love books, they love reading, they want to talk about it, they're always thinking about it. So, yes, I imagine that most of you might have avid reader tendencies. I personally do oscillate between avid reader and proficient because sometimes I don't have the time to spend reading. So I am at risk at losing that skill, and I know I am. So it's just, I think the identity aspect is so interesting. When it came to the interviewees themselves, I was able to capture at least one of each reading identity. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to grab reluctant readers in year 7 and 8, but I think that comes down more to the type of student that is going to respond to a reading survey, which is why I was really surprised that I got 2 year 9 students who were identified by the survey as reluctant readers, who then agreed to do an interview with me. And in that interview, it was very clear that they were reluctant readers. So I was super excited to be able to talk to those 2 individuals. But yeah, so a nice spread. And I think it was good to capture the different age levels as well. So I pulled out some interesting quotes. Some of these things that have just kind of sparkled off the page at me, and I wanted to share them with you. And please excuse my teenage girl voice, but here we go. So, well, often I'll be like watching movies and stuff more often now because it kind of requires less brain power than reading does. Fair. Like when I'm on holidays or something, I can just read for like 2 hours straight. Yeah. I kind of decided to go for what I'm in the mood for reading. So what's really interesting about these quotes from my perspective is that the brain power comment, I get it. And you can see that happening in schools. The cramped curriculum, the all the other things that students are doing these days, they are exhausted by the end of the day. And reading is hard work. Holiday reading, oh my goodness, so many students saying that they read on holidays because they have the time and the space and the headspace to be able to read. Adults said this as well. And then deciding what they're in the mood for, we are seeing such a huge trend in the book industry for mood reading. It's kind of like the new genre thing. So it's like I don't want to just read fantasy books. I want to read something that's going to make me cry or make me feel really happy and it comes back to that idea of reading aesthetic reading, which I'm super excited about, which is all about reading for pleasure, reading for that feeling that you get when you read. And so our students want aesthetic reading, but they don't always have the opportunity to do it. Reluctant readers. So these are some of the quotes that I pulled from my interviews with the 2 reluctant readers. So I keep having to reread the paragraph because I can't understand what it says the first time, which is really annoying. So that barrier for that student, that skill barrier has developed into this, yeah, I don't like reading at all because I'm not good at it. I feel like forcing us to read made reading not fun. Fair. If you get forced to read something, where's your choice? Where's your agency? Where's your autonomy in this? TikTok is more interesting. Yep. And it's bite-sized too. Reading is hard. TikTok is easy. I just don't see the need. That one kind of scared me a little bit. Reading is so important for their academic success, but not just that, it's their well-being and who they are as a person and the way that they can get experiences from different people. And so not seeing the need is like, oh, we have a PR problem with reading here in this school. We need better communication around why it's important, but not just communication from what we as adults think is the appropriate message, but how do the students receive that message? Yeah, anyway, so I could talk about that for ages, but it's interesting that we have to find new ways of communicating that. Like, how would I feel if someone gave me a book? Thanks, but no thanks. That exact wording. But it's interesting that they go on to say, if the school gave me a book, yes, if it was relative. If it was a relative, they're really excited about it, yes. So, even the student who initially said, no, I wouldn't read a book if someone gave it to me, if the school gave them the book or if a relative gave them the book, they would still maybe read it, which I thought was interesting. And it just kind of shows how the influence of the person giving the student the reading material can have an impact on whether or not that student then decides to follow through with reading it. So I thought that was interesting. Struggling to avid. So I am a big believer in that you can change. Your reading identities change. I myself fluctuate, as I said. And so this is a great example of someone who came into their school as a likely struggling reader and has since become an avid reader. So when I was in primary school, I didn't like to read or I wasn't engaged. I just didn't feel like a connection, I guess. And I would read maybe 2 to 3 books a year. But then when I went into high school, it was just very inclusive, and Miss just made me feel welcome and comfortable, and it was just really nice. And then she suggested some books to me and I read those books and I loved them. And she just kept on suggesting books. And it's just a really lovely, welcoming community. And because of that, I'm now the biggest book lover ever. So it wasn't about the books for this student. It wasn't about any intervention in their reading skill. It was about that relationship that the teacher librarian developed with the student that then turned into an opportunity to give them books so that the student would trust them to go, yeah, okay, I'll give that a go because I've got this relationship with you and I trust you. So I think that's super important in terms of the influence of a teacher librarian. And then I have to share this one with you because it's just beautiful. This is a avid reader talking about their school library collection because it's a world with no hate, I guess. And oh, that gives me chills because it's right. School library collections they should be safe places that have books in them that reflect everyone's experience. And so when you have a really beautifully curated collection that is something that your students use regularly, that they are excited to use, this is the kind of impact that it's having. So the types of resources in your collection and even the way that you display it is super important. So even though I identified that there are 4 identities for the purpose of my research, it is very clear to me that there is a sliding scale and you can move between them, but also I'm realizing that there are different levels within the identities themselves because there are some avid readers who are avid readers. They tick all the boxes. But then you have those ones that I would almost call obsessed readers because they go that next level and they are doing anything and everything they can to always be reading, which is slightly different. So, you know, it's interesting that even within these categories, these identities, there's still some movements and fluctuation. And the reluctant readers too, there are some that are just so disengaged and disenchanted with reading that they are just flat out, nah, I don't read. You can't even give me a book. There are those reluctant readers, like the one that we heard about earlier, who said, if the school gave me a book or it was a relative, then yeah, I might engage with it. So it's just interesting to me that identity is such a key factor, and it's worth knowing where the students are in terms of their identity. But what I always stress is that it's not fixed. It changes, and we have to accept that. Okay, teachers. Some of the things that the teachers were talking about, it's interesting to me when I ask teachers about reading, they automatically go to reading in terms of skill comprehension, because that's what teachers are mostly focused on, right? Whether or not their students have the ability to do the tasks that they need them to do to succeed academically. And so, when I said to teachers, what about the reading in your school? They would often mention things like, I wish that, we could, or that students could read to complement what they're learning in history. Yeah, but is that allowing the student the opportunity to choose, or are you kind of enforcing your opinion on that student and your classes? Um, and then it was interesting when I talked to other teachers who have the same mentality that I do, that there should be opportunities for reading in terms of just reading whatever you want, where they said something like, I just wish that reading was valued a bit more by other people, other than just the library staff or the English teachers. And so then there's that value within the school itself. How does the school staff value reading? Maybe a bit more support from above was a comment that I got a lot. Above being school leadership team, middle and senior or executive team leadership. Talking about the teacher librarian, when I asked about the TL in particular, there were some really interesting responses from the 3 different schools. But what was really clear that in the small school, there was lots of positive things coming out from the staff. So her knowledge and her expertise, or at least her vision, can be listened to. And there's a little bit of her branching out in all different ways. So, this staff member was saying that, yeah, this teacher is about reading, but also they have a finger in every pie in this school, and that's how they develop relationship with the staff. And that's how they then get a little bit of her in everything. And then talking about the library culture that she had created, it's a celebratory place. It's not just about reading or research, it's about connection, community, celebration. And then that teacher librarian then uses that opportunity to say, hey, by the way, here's a book. I think the personality of the librarian informs the personality of the space. And when I share that with, people in the presentations that I have been doing, you can see the moment of, oh boy, because the way that we present ourselves as teacher librarians or school library staff or librarians, sometimes we find it hard to be a bubbly, enthusiastic person because we're not all that person, right? And I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody needs to be out. My mic just cut out, but I should be back hopefully. Yeah.
You're back.
Yeah. So so the personality, and I'm not suggesting that everybody should be a super bubbly, enthusiastic person because we're not all that person, but the way that you are perceived in the library by the students and the staff is such an important thing. And so you have to be welcoming. You have to have some level of, yeah, I actually want you in this space. And it's just interesting that there's always that moment of when I suggest that. Also, interesting things that teachers said was about the fact that they weren't always aware of what was happening in the library, which tells me that communication between the library and the staff and the school is just sometimes non-existent. I'm not informed or connected to what students are doing in the library on a day-to-day basis like I was in the past. Got me thinking about how much of the responsibility is that on the teacher librarian versus the teachers. Should everybody be trying to figure out what's happening in the library, or is it just the sole responsibility of the library to get the word out there? Something that I need to think about. A culture of reading has been shifted down the priority list. Super interesting that the two larger schools that I spoke to, they were very much about academic success. They were about we are supporting our students to be the best students that they can be academically. And then when I talked to some of the staff, they were like, yeah, reading's not so much a priority anymore. It used to be, and now it's not. So this is kind of evidence of what I call the fundamental disconnect between the understanding of what reading for pleasure can do for academic success. It supports it. It doesn't detract from it. In fact, it can support students who are struggling academically more than other interventions, depending on how you go about it and what you allow them to read. So the fact that schools are shutting down opportunities to read for pleasure is a little bit worrying, because it's like, oh, you don't get it. How do we get you to get it? So principals, oh man, I talked to all three of them for about an hour each. I'd originally only thought I'd be in there for about half an hour, but with the conversations that I had were really interesting, and the principals had a lot to say, so I just sort of let them say it. And so the smaller school library said things like if the TL's personality, teacher librarian's personality, wasn't there, it would be really different actually. So they acknowledged that the personality of the teacher librarian is the personality of the library. So they were echoing what some of their staff was saying. I thought that was a fascinating connection. I got so many mentions about metrics and data and evidence, particularly around borrowing. But in the teacher librarian school library community, we always say a book borrowed is not necessarily a book read. Um, but that's the metric that principals are familiar with. So it's the one that they often rely on. Um, Interesting perceptions around what is considered appropriate reading material. For example, audiobooks, it's a very passive experience. I think that depends on how you are engaging with your audiobook. I know people who put an audiobook on and do nothing but listen to that audiobook. I don't know if they would agree that it's passive experience for them. And then I love that one of the principals was always being given her reading from the teacher librarian, and that connection was so strong, that relationship was so evident, and she spoke very highly about the personality of the teacher librarian and the space and the reading culture and everything. So that was interesting. Driving academic outcomes was, a big focus of the principals' jobs, their ideas for the school. Um, the discussion around what would you do for your library, or if you had unlimited budget, what would you do? I thought it was interesting that the first thing a principal who was getting year five and year sixes to join their school in the following year and needed to have building works done, her answer to this question was, I'd love to have an author on site for a week or 2 weeks, rather than thinking about how she was going to accommodate an extra, 2 year levels in a school that is already at 1,000 students and the library is tiny. But her idea with an unlimited budget was to get an author in rather than expanding the space or adding an extra staff member or yeah, something a bit more practical rather than experiential. After she said that, she did go on to say, oh, but I suppose, a bigger library would be nice too. So it was just interesting. Um, and then talking about budgets and how many students would be needed for that school to support an additional staff member was really interesting. I got told by the two schools that were about 1,000 that if they went over 1,000, then they would consider adding an extra teacher librarian on staff because of the funding and whatever that they would get from that student number. But what is the difference between 990 students and 1,001 in terms of staffing? It was, yeah, interesting. And then talking about how school libraries and teacher librarians are often put forward for awards by some principals, particularly one in particular. She said, we are always putting our teacher librarian out there, nominating her for awards, encouraging her to do things, celebrating all the extra things that she does. And so, we put her forward for an excellent award this year. She didn't win, but we'll try again next year. And I love that because they're like, yeah, okay, we can take that feedback. We'll try a different category, but we want to recognize what you do publicly. Um, so in terms of the teacher librarians, I hadn't gotten to do a deep analysis or a skating analysis in time for this presentation. So I just did a word cloud using NVivo of all of the teacher librarian responses. And the words that it spat out were fascinating to me, particularly the judged word. I was not expecting judged to come up like it did. It makes me feel a bit sad, worried that there is this perception in the 3 teacher librarians that they are feeling judged. I think there's a difference between feeling like you are leading and you are observable and you are modeling best practice versus being judged. So yeah, I'm going to delve deeper into that for sure, but this was just really a bit of a shock for me. Other things though, period here often refers to the period of time that classes happen. We often call them period 1, period 2, period 3 for those that aren't in schools. So that's what that is, talking about the periods that they have available to them to do things in their day. But yeah, affirming was really nice to see. Activities, community events, love, kids, kind, structure, meeting. So yeah, this word cloud, I didn't expect it to give me as much to think about as it has, and I'm really glad that I did that. And yeah. So in terms of some of the suggestions and observations that I make for the teacher librarians that I give this presentation to, my goal is to give them something practical to walk away with, to think about, that is linked to my preliminary findings. So the first thing that I say to them is that when you look at the literature, it's very clear that job descriptions for teacher librarians and school library staff highlight the fact that they want someone who can build a reading culture, that they have a love of reading, that they can create exciting and engaging reading events, and can curate and manage collections to meet the needs of the community and inspire students to read. But in reality, when the job comes around and you start doing it, it becomes more like this. You start getting into the curriculum side of things, the collaborative teacher. You are an information specialist, a technology adopter, a digital literacy leader, pastoral carer was really interesting. And then amongst all of that, you also have to be your reading for pleasure advocate. And so much more. And so even though the literature says, we want teacher librarians and school library staff who can build a reading culture, the reality is we also want you to be able to do all of these things. And of course, from my discussions with principals, reading for pleasure is getting further and further down the priority list. But it's still interesting that they have been putting it in their job descriptions. And I just wonder if that's a hangover or again, one of those things that just hasn't been updated. Anyway, more investigation needed there. So then I start to sort of say to them, okay, so when you're in a school library, there are clearly conflicting priorities for you and your school. And so how are you going to show that your priorities can align with the school's priorities? That is how you're going to use your influence. That is how you are going to show to your principals, who are very much academic focused, that, reading for pleasure could be a way to support that. But how are you going to do that? So I always suggest that sometimes you need to be subtle about it. Sometimes you might need to be a bit more forceful. But then what was also really interesting is that in my interviews with students, they are very aware when they are not the priority. They are very aware when they are being seen as an academic figure, data, rather than a student. And they know when their feelings are no longer the focus of the school. And so, teacher librarians, we have this opportunity to make sure that the students know that we are also for them, that they are a priority for the school library, because it's a place where, everyone is supposed to be supported. It's a safe place. So yeah, just to remind people of that has always been really powerful too. The collection that you have, I've already touched on this, it's a world with no hate. So that idea of how your collection is set up and the way that your students engage with it and the type of material that's in it. We have that metaphor of the windows, mirrors, and sliding doors where they can see into different people's lives. They can have something reflected back to them so they can see some of their own life in there. And then the sliding doors where they can step through and experience someone else's experience as well. So it's an older idea from the 80s and 90s, but it's still so relevant to today's collections. And so, how are we doing that? How are we considering that for our students? Because we want to build a world with no hate. We want them to engage and feel and get those aesthetic reading experiences. And so the other thing that I've been thinking about is the way that students browse, the way that they get information, the way that they access different social medias, and how is that reflected in their experience inside a library, because they don't experience libraries the same way that older generations do. they have a different way of seeking information. They have a different way of browsing. So we need to consider that in the way that we display our collections and design our library spaces for the students. And then the final thing that I'll say about the collections is the idea about reading material privilege. I'm super passionate about this, and it comes from the idea that reading, when you say to someone, do you read? Most people will automatically go to the, oh yeah, a book, a novel. Yep, cool. That's what you mean. No, we need to diversify what we think of as reading, because reading comes in so many different forms and formats now. And particularly that idea that reading in the traditional sense is very much based on a colonizer perspective, because it's, that English novel. But by not valuing the different types of reading material out there, such as graphic novels, audiobooks, digital literature, so many other things, those different mediums, formats, genres, whatever you want to call them, all have different elements from different cultures in them. And so by not thinking that those have value, where is that perspective coming from? It's something that I'm exploring further, and I'm finding it very interesting. So yes, I always suggest to the staff for this, your school library policies, they're your protection. That's how you protect your collection and why you're doing it. And your collection is an extension of the teacher librarian. So it's you having an influence when you're not physically there. And that's always, I think, a bit of a light bulb moment for them as well. Just very quickly, the networking to problem solve, the teacher librarians, the three that I spoke to, yes, they had library teams. Yes, they had other staff in the library to bounce their ideas off of. But the difference is none of them had an additional teacher librarian in their school library. And so they were bouncing ideas off library aides, library technicians, librarians. And whilst those people are fabulous, fantastic people, there is a little bit of a difference between a teacher librarian and a librarian, and that the teacher librarian has the teacher aspect. And so we, have a different background, different perspective. And so, how are they accessing other teacher librarians to talk to when they're feeling isolated? Networking is one of those things. But even some of the conversations that I had with them in my interviews, they'd say at the end, oh, it was so great to talk to another teacher librarian. I'm going, yeah, we need to be doing this more. So the whole idea of, engaging online is something that I float in terms of connecting when you are feeling isolated. Some get a little bit scared by that idea because, I have to put myself out there. I have to find connections. I have to be willing and open to, do the effort with no guarantee. But it's so worth it when you find your people, and teacher librarians are so lovely. And anyway. And then coming back to the personality idea, it's so clear to me that the way that the school library is used by students is influenced by the staff in it and how they present themselves to students and staff, but mostly students. If you want people in your library, you have to let them know that they are welcome. And your personality is one of those things, as well as your collections and your spaces and all sorts of other things, but definitely the personality. And so, successful reading cultures, I had a meeting with my supervisors yesterday, and one of them, Mary, floated the idea of coming up with some way to, measure a school reading culture. So I'm thinking about that. Maybe not for the PhD, maybe that's an after project. But, identifying certain things that make a reading culture successful, you've got your typical things like you need support. How do you get that support? You are strategic. You make relationships, you make connections. How do you get your school on board? You make relationships, you make connections. You show the school that the school library is for them. It's for the community. It's not just something that you've decided. It's for everybody. Getting students in to the library is a challenge for many teacher librarians, well, for at least the 3 teacher librarians that I spoke to. once they get them in, that's when you can start to develop those relationships. But getting students in is a problem. So if you can get access to your students, that's half your battle. Investing in your material, in your spaces, tricky when budgets are tight, but even just the way that you present your material and your spaces. You don't have to have new furniture. You don't always have to have new books, but how is it presented, visually displayed? So important. Social media is something that I have been talking to students and school libraries about in the interviews. I could do a whole other thing on that. So just very briefly, I think we need to, as school libraries, teacher librarians, consider how we can harness social media to extend our reach beyond the physical space to get to those students who don't always come in, and then to try and get them in. And then, book clubs. What's really interesting is that the perception for most teacher librarians about a book club is that it often has to still be academic. Why can't your book club be a genre club or a books that, why does it have to be, let's talk about the literary devices and structure of the book? Why can't it be, this book made me feel this, or let's talk about graphic novels, or let's focus on the social aspect, because it's reading for pleasure that I'm pushing, and the pleasurable side of things gets a little bit hampered by that constant, yeah, but what are you learning from this? Sometimes it's okay just to read because you want to read and you have feelings about it and you want to share it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Krystal. That was awesome.
Thank
Lots
you.
of clapping hands. Any question? Do you want to stop sharing your screen so that we can see everyone? Any question?
I got one. Krystal?
Oh, yeah, go Vic.
Hello. Excellent. Love it.
Thank
so
you.
Interesting. Made me think about, I've got a 13 and a 16-year-old, if you want to trial any of those strategies, at a large scale public high school, and I don't think either of them have been into the library, and they're both quite academic. So there you go. Secondly, what I wanted to ask you was, what's your output? Like, what are you hoping to achieve through your research, other than obviously that practical? So I'm loving the idea of giving back as you're going along. That's really cool. Yeah, what's your big aim?
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest with you, I don't have a big vision in mind for the end. I guess that idea of creating some sort of tool or framework to evaluate a school reading culture, which we kind of just popped up yesterday in my conversations with my supervisors, is one thing that is an avenue that I could explore. For me, though, it's more about finding the evidence of the teacher librarians doing good things in the schools and getting that information out there in terms of publications in which they're going to be read by the people who need to read them. So I am thinking about, education journals that teachers might come across, not just the teacher librarians, but the wider education field, to kind of say, hey, have you thought about accessing your teacher librarian to help you with this? So I don't have an output plan, which is something that I noticed is very different between the communications PhDs and the creative element that often happens at the end versus what I'm doing, which is very much more just, yeah, not so creative at this point. I hope that answered your question.
Never say just, though, Krystal.
No, I was about to say that. Never say just. It's just so interesting how different approaches are all worthy and valid, and what you're discovering is the purpose of doing it, and that discovery is all, horses for courses. It's great.
Thank you.
Other questions? Anne, you put your hand up.
Hi, Anne. You're on mute.
You're on mute, Anne.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just interested. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I was just interested in the not book reading. You said that you're advocate of not book reading, because I don't know. I've read somewhere. I have no idea. Not recently, but I did read somewhere that actually the young people are at the kind of lower level more literate than they've ever been because they're online all the time. So they might be going, oh may, OMG, LOL or whatever it is nowadays. I have no idea. But they, that they're actually more literate, and that might be about to change when they all go onto videos. But that, and they are actually reading wads of text, even if they're not reading wads of books. And so that would have to be a help, wouldn't it? Right? I mean, that they are at least engaging with language in some capacity, even if it's not, grammatically as it could be, but they're probably still advanced on where they would be if they weren't doing it at all. So I mean, obviously it's a very sliding scale between being completely illiterate and being, Proust or someone, but I just wondered where your thoughts were, because you're quite happy to say someone is or isn't a reader. So I guess I just wondered how you address that sort of sliding scale of literacy.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say with that is, in my mind, there are three kinds of literacy. You have illiterate, which is, can't read at all. And that percentage of people in the world who are illiterate is getting smaller and smaller. And they become literate because the definition of literacy, to be literate, is to read and write a simple sentence. So the bar is pretty low to be identified as literate. But then there's this third type of literacy, which I think fits really nicely with the idea of whether or not you are a reader. It's called a-literate, where you can read but choose not to, which is very much what that proficient reader is based on. And it's what a lot of adults do. Particularly because, we spend a lot of our time reading for work. So we then don't want to read afterwards. So we can read, but we just choose not to in our own time. In terms of what a reader is, this is something that is such a big question. And I purposefully try not to define reading material as, reading for pleasure material, because who am I to say that a student who chooses to read nonfiction information books for pleasure isn't considered, reading for pleasure material? Even though I personally wouldn't do that, that's where they get their pleasure from. I think the line and this is the digital literature question too, what is digital literature? There are so many different formats of reading material now that, again, I'm not going to be the one that says the story narrative video game that you're engaging with is digital literature. So yeah, that's but also where I was kind of going with the reading material privileging idea, in that there is the perception that reading is one type of thing. And if you're not doing that type of reading, then you're not reading. But I want to challenge that. I want to say, no, actually, if they're doing these types of reading, it is reading. So yeah, it's certainly it's a bigger question, and it's something that I have lots of thoughts around. It's very difficult to define, for sure. Rachel?
Just following on from that, I mean, clearly if people are online and they're, reading things that are in a modern digital parlance, they're learning something. But it doesn't necessarily help them when they then come to university and write an essay. And we can't really assume that it is particularly related to a lack of literacy and reading. There's a range of factors that contribute to horrible essays.
Yep.
But I mean, I would argue that seeing how different authors structure that particular kind of formal literature in what you would get typically as a book gives students a stronger indication of how language can work to tell a complex story than Facebook does. It doesn't mean that there's not all value across these forms, but I think you mentioned earlier that people didn't like the idea of the pleasure reading somehow wasn't constructive. It's like any exposure to that particularly constructed form of language is constructive because it shows them, it models for them how they could do that for themselves, right? Is there any element of what you're researching that looks at this sort of affect?
It's interesting that you say affect, because when I was doing the initial literature review about reading, I came across some research that's come out of the 80s by Rosenblatt, aesthetic and efferent reading, two different categories, I suppose. And so the efferent reading is that reading that you do for, it comes from the Latin word of carrying away. So you carry meaning away from the text, right? So when you engage in efferent reading, you are learning something, whether it be the structure of the text or the information in it or whatever. And then you've got the aesthetic reading, which is very much that feeling, emotive thing. And I think my, and I'm just processing this now, which is a great question to make me do this. I think my idea, my point is that it's okay to allow our students the opportunity to do aesthetic reading purely for the sake of aesthetic reading. Yes, they do need to engage with a wide variety of materials. They do need to be exposed to a range of different formats, because that is how, as you say, they will pick up inadvertently different skills and strategies. But at the same time, I don't want school libraries, when they are encouraging reading for pleasure, to completely discount the other types of material that their students might find pleasure in.
No.
Yeah, so
they need to be free to do all of that.
Yes.
But I do think it is an interesting point, though, because the way that they deal with this through metrics isn't right either. Like, giving people the freedom to explore whatever they want is on one side, great. There's going to get something out of it one way or the other. On the other side, the way that it gets measured doesn't capture what they're learning. And neither would it if they were just pleasure reading and reading books. So there's a real disconnect between what they get from all these different tools and how we look at that. So it's a question, no answer, but I did want to know if that was something your research was talking to. Thank you for that.
That's
a really nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish I had the time.
I
really do. But
can I just add something to what Rachel said? Just a conversation a little bit. Yeah, so it was interesting because I'm doing this thing on, architecture of 8 libraries around Sydney, and in Liverpool out west, in a poor area. I couldn't help, this beautiful new library, and I couldn't help but notice on the ground floor they had just in the front. You walk in the front, there's a sort of round, one of the wheelie bookshelves on wheels, and it's filled with pulp fiction. I mean, just junk, just absolute. I mean, I think Captain Underpants, which I'm loved Captain Underpants. I don't know if you remember this story. Did you get Captain Underpants here? This kid's book where the superhero goes around in underpants, which is actually a work of literature. But nevertheless, you could not aim lower, right? And you really wonder, this enormous library, and then they're pushing Captain Underpants. What is the I think why what you're doing is important, because what's the rationale behind doing this? Just because it's got more than 5 pages and it's stapled together at the corner. I mean, is this like a gateway drug, hopefully, to Proust? I mean, what is it's a very interesting, it's a huge topic of what are they actually trying to do here?
Yeah.
So,
and I think I just want to challenge the thinking here a little bit around.
Yeah, sure.
Not everyone's going to be capable or want to read Proust.
No, exactly.
And I think your academically minded students are going to seek out opportunities to expose themselves to literature that challenges them. That's what avid readers do. It's what, we hope that we can get students to do, to engage with material that challenges them. But at the same time, we have to accept that there is differentiation in student ability and desire to read. And so if Captain Underpants, which yes, I read as I loved them. They were hilarious. It got me reading. It got me to read something. It got me to sit down and read for an extended period of time, which, by the way, that in and of itself has significant impacts on a student's ability to learn and academic success and all of that. So in my mind, if it's pleasure reading, if they're sitting and reading that funny, easy to digest book, valid. a valid thing. And if that library, if they've identified that their community are not big readers, that maybe they don't even have, you know, some of the classics in their collection because their community is not interested in that, it's, in my opinion, potentially wasted space. If your community doesn't want it, don't have it on the shelves, put something that they will actually engage with if your space is limited and your budget is limited. So yeah, they've obviously decided that this is the way that we're going to get people into the doors, and we'll start them off with Captain Underpants. And then, yeah, maybe, as you say, it is a gateway to going, ooh, what's next? What else have you got? What else can I read? So yeah, I think different levels, different abilities, different preferences. We have to cater for everything when it comes to reading for pleasure.
You probably
And
Captain
we've
Underpants
got-
is a bad example because he's there, you know, that's kind of elevated literature. That's probably a lot lower than Captain Underpants.
Okay,
Sorry,
we've got 4 minutes. Jane, it's better be very quick one.
It's going to be a quickie.
The last
promise.
one.
When you chose your schools, did you
Mhm.
do any look at the sort of socioeconomic status of the kids, and that had an influence on like whether parents are reading?
Yeah. So I definitely asked every interviewee that I had from the students whether or not their families read. It was really interesting, the responses that I got. There was always a member of the family that read, whether it was dad, mum, or a grandparent. Sometimes it was even an aunt. So there was always an adult in their family that was supportive of reading in some way, shape, or form. Even the reluctant readers would have, you know, a parent who said, oh yeah, or a family member. So that was really interesting. But in terms of the socioeconomic status of the 3 different schools, 2 ended up being fairly similar, and they are, no surprises, the 2 largest schools. And they have 2 very similar approaches to education and their school structure and the staffing in their library. So they were really great comparable libraries in my opinion. The smaller school, fascinating. In a lower socioeconomic area, lots of refugee students there, less than 300, not a lot of, a lot of non-English speaking as a first language students as well. So they had a larger language collection and, yeah, a very, very different kind of collection for their students. And yet they had the better, in my opinion, reading culture because they had the teacher librarian who had more access to the students. But I wonder if you can do that if there's one of you and 300 students versus one of you and close to 1,000 students. So, you know, yeah.
Interesting. I was thinking I'd love you to do your study in one of the children's jails because they have libraries and kids with all sorts of issues, and access to the children is difficult, and yeah, be an interesting place to look at. Thanks, Krystal.
Thank you.
Okay, a couple of minutes, but I don't think there is, we can have another question, but maybe something to, a statement to close today's session, Krystal, coming from you. What would you like us to think further, or, you know, I mean, I learned a lot today.
Well, thank you. For me, it's about really uncovering what teacher librarians, and this is so applicable to any library staff member, you know, like we talk to all libraries and we all have the same thing. How are we engaging with our audience, our community, and putting them first and showing that we are putting them first? Because that is how, in my opinion, you build those relationships and those connections, and that is how you then have influence. It's how you get your influence into the communities. So that's something that I am certainly thinking about, not just in terms of reading cultures in schools, but, you know, information literacy, or the way that, yeah, just so many different avenues that we could explore that idea through. So if you have ideas.
Anyway, 1 minute to 1 o'clock. I think we better close today's session. Thank you so much, Krystal. That was awesome work.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and see you in next month's session.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks. Bye.